Joining me today is Greg Potter, who got his PhD from the University of Leeds, and he studied circadian biology, sleep, and metabolic health, which is super interesting. Sleep is foundational to our overall health, which is why I'm excited to jump into a lot of this discussion today. So Greg, do you mind just introducing yourself and maybe introducing a bit of your research at the University of Leeds? I'm not exactly familiar with exactly what you studied, so it'd be cool to go over that.
Yeah, so I'm broadly interested in how all aspects of lifestyle affect both how we feel, but also our risk of chronic disease. And that has been the case since my early teens. I ended up at the university in Loughborough studying sport and exercise science. Did my master's there too. And it was around that time that I became very interested in sleep and biological rhythms. And so I was looking around for PhDs and saw the opportunity at the University of Leeds. And as you touched on, my work focused on the relationships between how we sleep and how we eat, and subsequently our risk of cardiometabolic diseases. And I was involved in a few different projects. As is often the case, the PhD changed quite a lot from what was written down in the brief that I signed up for. But I was involved in some work looking at how people sleep in the UK using a large data set and how that relates to things like what they eat, but also their body mass index, their blood pressure, blood lipids, blood sugar regulation, and so on. I did some work looking at the development and validation of a way of tracking people's diets, and it's named MyFood24. It's a 24-hour diet recall method. I did some of the lab work for that, and then subsequently used the data set to look at the associations between people's diet timing and how they distribute their energy and macronutrient intakes, and some metabolic health outcomes, although we never actually published that research. And then I was involved in a randomized controlled trial of supplementation with a timed release form of melatonin as a prophylactic measure against the development of type 2 diabetes in adults at high risk for type 2 diabetes development, because these people have first degree relatives who have type 2 diabetes. Again, that work hasn't been published. And then alongside that, I did a few bits and pieces too. And nowadays I am the co-founder and chief science officer of a UK-based nutrition startup named Resilient Nutrition. And we make food products, and we will eventually make supplements too, designed to help people sustainably feel and perform better.
Cool. How do you implement any education around sleep into resilient nutrition? Is there, or is it mostly just supplements, or are there like guides for better sleep or anything?
No guides as yet. So resilient nutrition isn't the only thing that I do. On the side, I also help some people with their sleep, mostly psychiatric patients who have depression or anxiety or some other mental health problem. And I also do some work with various athletes. Some of that is through resilient nutrition. Most of that right now is with ultra endurance athletes. And through some of that work, I help people with their sleep. But at Resilient Nutrition, our first products aren't sleep focused. However, being the science guy, the nerd on the team, I am involved in content creation. And I recently wrote a free ebook named The Principles of Resilient Nutrition that people can download if they're interested. It's resilientnutrition.com/principles, shameless plug. And over time, as we build out that content library, I hope to also address sleep education, of course. And that's something that I do myself on the side, just mostly via my Instagram. I've got a goal to post once a week this year. I'm not fantastic at social media and I'm slightly allergic to it, but hopefully it does share some helpful information.
Yeah. You mentioned working with psychiatric patients, and I've always thought about when people are struggling with their sleep, if they should go to like a psychologist, and instead of like looking for sleep remedies, maybe it's just a lot of mental problems where a psychologist would actually help them with their sleep problems instead of taking like sleep formulas or supplements or something. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And interestingly, the first line therapy for people who have insomnia specifically is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy, which has been widely used by psychologists for eons. And the tricky thing about sleep problems is that they're, for the most part, multifaceted. And often in the case of insomnia, continuing that example, there's some sort of precipitating life event. And often that's something that results in a lot of psychological distress. In this instance, maybe it's somebody who's just had a loved one who's passed away because of COVID-19. And as somebody struggles with the consequences of that, often sleep temporarily goes out the window. Mm-hmm. And what can happen is that they can then start to engage in behaviors that perpetuate their sleep problems. And there's a scientist named Arthur Spielman who came up with this 3P model. So you've got the precipitating factor. You've also got predisposing factors. So as an example of this, if somebody is elderly, then they're more likely to develop sleep problems, more likely to experience insufficient sleep, fragmented sleep. And then you have those perpetuated factors, which I touched on. And an example of this would be spending more time in bed in order to hopefully get more sleep. But the problem is that if people spend more time in bed and they're awake during that time, then they learn to associate their bed with being somewhere that they're awake and not asleep. And so counterintuitively, perhaps, they need to spend less time in bed and make sure they only go to bed when they're sleepy, get out of bed if they're not falling asleep within 15 to 20 minutes, and not using their bed for anything apart from sleep and sex. So that was a roundabout answer to your question, but yes, absolutely. And with that said, not all sleep problems arise because of mental health issues.
Right.
There are plenty of circumstances where that's not the case. Sleep is very heterogeneous and we sleep in very different ways from each other. If you look at sleep disorders, for instance, then there are 6 broad categories of sleep disorders. And they include things like insomnias, parasomnias, sleep-related breathing disorders, and so on. And in some instances, there will be some sort of cause which is more or less purely physical. So if you look at narcolepsy, then maybe somebody has an autoimmune condition in which their immune system is attacking specific cells in the brain. So those are hypocretin producing cells in the lateral hypothalamus. And because of that, they struggle to sustain clear cycles of sleep and wake. So in that case, it's more or less purely biological. But in the case of insomnia in particular, it's often because of some related mental health problems. And the tricky thing is that it can be a vicious cycle, because if somebody has that inciting event, which then triggers a period of insomnia, there's this period in which it's not clinically diagnosable insomnia. So for somebody to be diagnosed with insomnia, depending on the guidelines that you look at, they need to have experienced the particular sleep problem with related daytime dysfunction at least 3 nights a week for the previous 3 months. So you can refer to insomnia as coming in 2 flavors. There's insomnia with a small I and insomnia with a big I. And it's really important to try and help people when they're in that little I phase, so they don't then transition into the big I phase when all of a sudden they, for the rest of their lives in many instances, go through periods of insomnia interspersed with better sleep.
So fascinating. That's really interesting research into sleep and all these factors that influence it. But let's take a sidetrack and get into just the foundations and the basics of it. So you've done a lot of work with circadian biology. Why don't you just explain what circadian rhythms are and how they're regulated in the body, and the most important factors that set these circadian rhythms?
Absolutely. Circadian rhythms are processes that are regulated by your body's clock that recur roughly every 24 hours. And the reason that we have these rhythms is that humans as is true of all organisms, evolved on a planet in which there are clear cycles in the environment. The most obvious is the light-dark cycle each day. And with that comes change in temperature. There are also cycles in things like food availability, humidity, and some other factors. So to thrive in those cyclical environments, organisms evolved their own timekeeping mechanisms. And these occur across different timescales. So you have ultradian rhythms, which are the shortest, and these recur less than 24 hours. An example of this would be your heartbeat. Then you have your circadian rhythms. Circa means roughly, dian means day, so these recur roughly every 24 hours. And then you have infradian rhythms, which recur over longer timescales. And humans don't really seem to be particularly seasonal, but some organisms are. If you think of deer, then they shed their antlers at certain times each year. And we have these rhythms in our biology to optimize our bodies for certain things at certain times of day so that we can anticipate changes in the environment and also adapt to them too. And some example of these, of course, include the sleep-wake cycle, but the reality is that it's likely that every one of the billions of cells in our bodies has its own molecular clock. And if we think about clocks at the level of the organs in our bodies, then the purpose is, of course, to create certain programs in those tissues for certain times of day. So if you think about your digestive system, then the speed of the migrating motor complex that pushes indigestible food from the stomach to the small intestine is about twice as high during the daytime compared to the nighttime. There are also diurnal, so 24-hour rhythms in certain processes, such as the uptake of some nutrients, change in electrolyte balance, and so on. If you think about your immune system, then at the level of the gut, there are roughly 24-hour cycles in the gut microbiota. And interestingly, if you look at other animals and you expose them to pathogens at times of day when they wouldn't normally be exposed to them, so specifically if you expose rodents to pathogens at the start of when they would normally be sleeping, then they're much more likely to pass away in response to those pathogens than if you expose them during their daytime, so when they'd normally be active. So again, the immune system is trying to anticipate some of these changes in pathogen exposure so that it can target the pathogens without targeting cells, and hence doing damage, as I mentioned in the case of narcolepsy. If you look at skeletal muscle, then there are rhythms in your muscles which will influence their ability to produce force at different times of day. And in general, it seems that musculoskeletal performance moves in lockstep with change in body temperature, such that most people are strongest when body temperature is highest, which is typically in the late biological afternoon, so roughly 6 p.m. or so. And then there's metabolism. And in the case of metabolism, a couple of relevant examples are diet-induced thermogenesis, the increase in metabolic rate that occurs for a period of time after eating food as your body digests and metabolizes the food. Diet-induced thermogenesis in the 2 hours or so following a standardized meal seems to be roughly 50% higher in the biological morning at about 8 a.m. than in the biological evening at about 8 p.m. Likewise, if you look at insulin sensitivity, Frank Shear's done some nice work showing that it's probably something like 17% higher in the biological morning than it is in the biological evening. These are standardized conditions, and factors such as physical activity influence these outcomes. But the point is that if we can understand how our body's clocks are regulated, then we can start to optimize our lifestyle so that we're living in accordance with some of those rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
Importantly, I said that our circadian rhythms aren't precisely 24 hours. And one way of showing this is to take people, have them go down into a cave, devoid of time cues. They have no idea what time of day it is outside. They're not exposed to change in the light-dark cycle. The temperature's held constant, the humidity is. They've got food access at regular times during the schedule. In those circumstances, most people's body's clocks slightly longer than 24 hours, more like 24 hours and 12 minutes. And so for that reason, our clocks need to be reset each day, because otherwise they just drift later and later. And we'd spend a lot of our time feeling like we were jet lagged. And the most important time cue, or Zeitgeber is the jargon that's used for that word, is the light dark cycle. And the way that our exposure to light influences the timing of our body's clocks depends on the phase of our clocks at the time of the light exposure. That might sound slightly cryptic. What I mean is that if you're going through a 24-hour day and you wake up at, say, 6 a.m., if you expose yourself to lots of high intensity light that contains lots of short wavelength light in particular, which often appears as blue or green, but full spectrum light that appears as white also has lots of this light in it typically, but it's the kind of light that you get outside on a sunny day. If you expose yourself to lots of that type of light, between about 2 hours before your normal wake time and 2 hours after your normal wake time, then you'll tend to anchor your clock earlier in the day. So if you're a real night owl, then exposing yourself to lots of light at that time will help advance your sleep-wake cycle, such that the following evening you find it easy to fall asleep earlier, and then the following morning you will wake up earlier. On the other hand, if you expose yourself to lots of that type of light, high intensity light, rich in short wavelength light, between roughly 4 hours before you would typically fall asleep and 2 hours after you would typically fall asleep, you'll tend to shift your clock later. So if we're speaking about an elderly person whose circadian system over time has gradually advanced earlier and earlier, and now they struggle to not wake up at 3 a.m. in the morning, getting lots of light around that time can help shift them later and live on a schedule which is in better alignment with the rest of the world. So that's important to setting some components of the circadian system, and in particular the sleep-wake cycle. Briefly, the way that that happens is that light enters the eye and it enters specialized cells in the eye named intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which are concentrated in the lower part of the retina. And these then relay information about patterns of light exposure back to a so-called master clock in the brain named the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is in the front of the hypothalamus. And what this does is it uses neuronal projections, hormones, and some secretions to then relay signals about time of day based on the light exposure to cells elsewhere in the body. Because if you think about a cell in your liver, then it's not really exposed to changes in the light dark cycle, so it needs to have internal time cues. And a key way by which it does this is that the master clock signals to the pineal gland that synthesizes melatonin. And melatonin synthesis takes place during the period of darkness each day. And melatonin then acts as an internal signal of darkness, telling cells throughout the body via the bloodstream to engage in activities of darkness. Mm-hmm. And if you just think about the cells throughout your body, then one way to think about the circadian system is that it would be really hard to drive a car and refuel it at the same time. Your body needs to go through distinct phases, 4 distinct processes, building things, breaking down things, etc. And so by using the circadian system to compartmentalize these processes, it can wake up at the start of each new day in a state of restoration such that it can do the things it needs to do each day, getting food, finding access to mates, etc., in order to survive and ultimately hopefully pass on its genes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you touched on a lot of things in there. I want to delve into a little bit on meal timing and how food influences and how that's a time cue for our peripheral clocks, which are the clocks outside of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. I forget what it's called. That's that what it was?
That's it.
And specifically, wait, I've lost my train of thought when I started getting into the verbiage. But yeah, anyways, we'll go into timing of food. And this is actually how I came across you, because I was researching for a project on using time restricted eating in shift workers and how that can be employed to optimize the circadian clocks in these individuals who work throughout the night. And then I went down a rabbit hole and found you on social media, and that's how I came across you. But your paper specifically, co-authored with Tommy Wood, was the only paper that I could find with legitimate sort of educational prescription or an educated guess at what would be the best time to eat, because all of the other time restricted eating literature just says that time restricted eating would benefit a shift worker, but it doesn't say when they should eat or any sort of actionable steps for these individuals. It almost implies that they shouldn't be shift working. So I appreciated your paper because it actually made sense and had something that was a tangible takeaway. But let's talk about how food sets the clocks in our peripheral clocks, how we should choose our meal timings around our clocks.
Sure. So you mentioned there that when we eat is very important to setting the time of certain clocks in our circadian system. And the reality is that this hasn't been very well studied in humans just yet, but there are good reasons to think that that's the case. So whereas the light-dark cycle is key to resetting the master clock each day, the timing of meals seems to influence certainly lots of the cells outside of the master clocks. In the context of humans, people have looked at the expression of certain genes in some blood cells. They also looked at how changing meal times can shift the blood glucose rhythms, which suggests that the cells that contribute to the changes in the blood glucose rhythm have themselves shifted. But arguably the best demonstrations that change in meal time shift these peripheral clocks come from studies of non-human animals. And Francesca Damiola did some interesting work on this in the year 2000, showing that if you change the time that rodents have access to food by 12 hours, so it's completely inverted, then within days, the timing of gene expression in organs such as the liver moves completely to the new schedule. The point is that if we want to have a resilient circadian system, then we want these different rhythms in our body to be playing the same tune. If you imagine a conductor in an orchestra, that's sort of the role that your SCN has each day. It's trying to keep all these different instruments in time with each other. And when they lose appropriate phase relationships because they're either running at different periods or because they're running at the same speed but they're out of line, there are reasons to think that some negative things can ensue. And much of the speculation about that is based on cross-sectional research that looks at people who undergo disruption to their body's clocks. And shift work is an obvious example of this. So if you look at shift workers, then they're typically at higher risk of developing diseases such as type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease. Their sleep tends to suffer because they're often trying to sleep at a circadian phase when their body's clock is promoting wakefulness. So they'll typically get less sleep, and then the quality of their sleep is impaired too. They're more likely to experience accidents at work. And they, of course, fulfill very important roles in our society. So we wrote that paper with a view to trying to be somewhat prescriptive, recognizing that, like you say, they are just guesses as to the best way to help those people. But the point is that if it's possible to more or less fix meal times each day, then you're giving those peripheral clocks strong time cues. And you're then potentially supporting your circadian system and everything that it influences in terms of your health and your function. And our suggestion was that shift workers should probably look to try and fix those as much as they can. And then when they deviate from those meal times, they should probably just have a relatively small snack, something that's relatively easy to digest, preferably high in protein, high in fiber, probably comprising no more than about 10% of calorie intake, because there's been some work on shift workers showing that when people have a small snack, 10% of daily energy intake, they might improve their performance slightly. They will reduce their hunger, and probably similarly to substantially larger snacks containing roughly 30% of daily energy intake. And they'll avoid some of the negative effects that can happen from eating a large meal during the biological nighttime when their body's clocks are promoting sleep. Issues such as gastrointestinal problems and so on. Shift work is a very obvious example. If you're not a shift worker, then you've probably experienced this type of disruption anyway in the context of jet lag. And you will have found it hard to sleep at your new time zone. You've probably experienced sleepiness, daytime fatigue, brain fog, and possibly some related impairments too. So maybe you found that if you exercised, then your exercise performance was worse as you adjusted to the new time zone. But then there are more subtle examples of this type of circadian disruption too, that are probably more pervasive. So because a lot of us now have quite weak time cues, we spend 88% of our lives indoors, sheltered from daylight, our body's clocks tend to drift later. And what's happened in recent years is that people's chronotypes, which is whether somebody's more of a morning lark or a night owl, have shifted a bit later. And the problem is that at least before the pandemic, people had to wake up at a certain time to work. So it's probable that they've lost sleep during the working week. And then when they have days off, they try and catch up on sleep. And because of that, their sleep timing is variable. They're changing the timing of many of their time cues too. And then they can experience negative consequences related to that. And if you look at late chronotypes, then they are generally more likely to engage in certain negative health behaviors, more likely to smoke, for instance, more likely to drink alcohol in excess. And they tend to have slightly worse metabolic and mental health too. So maybe their blood lipids don't look as good. Maybe their inflammatory markers are slightly higher. Maybe their blood sugar regulation is slightly worse. And maybe they're more likely to go on to develop depression. And that shift in sleep timing between work days and non-work days that I mentioned has since been dubbed social jet lag by a man named Till Roneberg, who I think is still at Ludwig Maximilian University in Germany. And the idea is that for these late chronotypes, as they transition to the start of the working week, for many of them, it's like flying multiple time zones to the east because they have to shift their clocks earlier once again. And we know that type of social jet lag also associates with a variety of negative health outcomes. But perhaps the best demonstration of this type of circadian system disruption is experimental circadian misalignment, in which you have people come into a lab and you expose them to light dark cycles that their bodies can't synchronize to. So one way of going about this is to use a so-called forced desynchrony protocol, which involves a recurring 28-hour day. And because the range of entrainment that your body can synchronize to is something like a 23-hour day to a 25-hour day, after 3 cycles of that 28-hour day, people are up and active at a 12-hour different time zone to where they started, and their body's clocks haven't adjusted to it at all. And you find that within those 3 days, quite a few of the people who would otherwise have been healthy become pre-diabetic, they have reversed cortisol rhythms, they have higher blood pressure, they have reduced heart rate variability, and the list goes on.
Within 3 days?
So, within 3 days, yeah.
Wow.
Again, that comes from Frank Shear's lab. Frank's at Harvard. And it doesn't seem that people adapt to that over time. So Stephen O'Shea's done some work showing that after 3 weeks of that type of misalignment combined with insufficient sleep, there appear to be traces of organ dysfunction. So it seems that people's pancreases aren't working as effectively. And likewise, if you take shift workers who you might think would have some adaptation to that type of misalignment, and you put them through the same type of experimental protocol, they suffer the same consequences. So the point is that we need to spend plenty of time outside each day during daylight, expose ourselves to minimal light during the sleep period, confine our food intake and our physical activity to the daytime too. And then we have to recognize that we live in these modern environments and many of us are shift workers. So the question is, how can we best navigate that process as well as use this knowledge to help us adapt in instances such as jet lag? So sorry, I know I went off on a tangent there.
No, that's fine. So the idea is just that we evolved in an environment where we were asleep, resting, and fasting during the night, and awake, active, and eating during the day. And now that we live in a 24/7 lifestyle with food, light, etc., we are misaligning these systems where we're active during times when we would be resting, etc. And now, as particularly in terms of this conversation, we're eating at times when we should be fasting. So, and this is misaligning the master clocks with the peripheral clocks, and that's associated with all the problems that you mentioned. So if we are awake throughout the day, intermittent fasting is a very popular practice that a lot of people are employing into their lives, but most people are skipping breakfast. And this would be a form of late time restricted eating. But there's been some more recent research on early time restricted eating, where people are eating earlier in the day, maybe be eating when we're more primed for the intake of nutrients, which would be earlier in the day based on these circadian rhythms. So do you want to discuss like the difference between late and early, and any research that would, like, what your opinion is on people who are skipping breakfast, and maybe if we are maintaining a late time restricted eating schedule, if we're doing that every single day and we're having the exact same time cues of food intake every single day, do you think that that could kind of overcome the problems that might, like, it's still creating a robust, it would still be a time cue for a robust rhythm in our metabolism. So yeah, maybe discuss some of that.
Yeah, that's a big question. So I'll try and unpack some of it. First, just to define terms, time restricted eating, the way that I define it, entails confining intake of all calorie containing items to a period of 12 hours or less each day. Some people refer to that as intermittent fasting. I think of intermittent fasting as periodically going for at least 24 hours without consuming anything. And if you look at all of the research on time restricted eating, then it seems that when people go through a period in which they're confining their food intake, their calorie intake, to a period of 4 to 10 hours each day, they experience a range of health benefits. They typically consume fewer calories, which probably accounts for the weight that they lose. They lose some fat mass, their fasting glucose improves, their triglycerides tend to decline a bit too. So if you look across the whole body of research, then it seems to be beneficial. But within time restricted eating, there's a question of whether we can optimize the approach by playing with some variables. And what you mentioned there is this concept of early time restricted eating. So that would be using a relatively short caloric period and fixing it quite early in the waking day. So let's say that you wake up at 6 a.m. That might entail eating between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. And there have been several studies on this subject in the last 3 years or so. There was some nice work by Elizabeth Sutton in 2018 that took adult men who have prediabetes, and they all went through two conditions. And in one condition, they consumed all of their calories between 8 a.m. and about 2 or 3 p.m. So that was the early time restricted eating condition for 5 weeks. And in the other condition, they consumed them all between about 8 a.m. and about 8 p.m. So compared to most people who spread out their calorie intakes over about 14 or 15 hours each day, that's actually probably still a form of time restricted eating, but it was substantially longer than the other condition. And what they found was that when they had standardized diets that were specifically designed such that they didn't lose any weight, they had meaningful improvements in insulin sensitivity, reductions in oxidative stress, drop in morning blood pressure about 10 millimeters of mercury. And that's a large effect size. That's comparable to anti-hypertension medications. And they've since done a couple of shorter term studies looking at the effects of only a few days of early time restricted eating. They found that counterintuitively, people's appetite is more even keeled when they use early time restricted eating. And the physiological basis of that seems to be that their ghrelin levels, ghrelin being a hormone mostly produced by the stomach that promotes food intake, on average are slightly lower each 24 hours. They've also shown that blood glucose levels on average are slightly lower. And there are some other metabolic changes that take place. For example, when people wake up in the morning, their ketones tend to be higher during this early time restricted eating condition. And there are some changes in gene expression too. And you can make of that what you will. I'm not quite sure how to interpret those, to be honest. So that research is promising. And there have been a few studies that have fixed the amount of time that takes place within the caloric period. So let's say it's 8 hours, but they just move the timing of it a bit. And those results have tended to show small beneficial effects of the time restricted eating. So there was some work by Australian researchers showing that while both conditions did improve some measures of metabolic health, the earlier condition led to greater improvements in fasting glucose. But we're talking about small effect sizes. And the issue to consider here is that early time restricted eating isn't practical for lots of people. And if you look at the body of research at large, then what you find is that when the caloric period, the time restricted eating window, is stipulated, people are much more likely to experience negative side effects, nausea, vomiting, and so on. Whereas when people can choose the timing of the caloric period, they're less likely to experience those biological events, but they're also more likely to find it doable in the context of their lives. Because if you look at meals, for most people, that's a key social event each day. And early time restricted eating wouldn't work in a family setting for many people. It would conflict with lots of social events. And importantly, I think that occasional deviations from time restricted eating are absolutely fine. The goal should always be to be relatively regular about these time cues, but occasional deviations, I think, are very unlikely to be problematic and are probably actually a good thing if it means that you're going out and seeing your friends and having a good time. So there's that, but there are various other considerations here too, such as exercise. And I mentioned earlier that body temperature is highest in the afternoon, and for that reason, certain aspects of physical performance tend to be highest at that time too. There's big variation between people here, but interestingly, if you look at Olympic records, for instance, then they tend to be set in the late afternoon or early evening, which is no great surprise based on these changes in our circadian systems. And there's been some research looking at people with poor metabolic health, showing that if they go through two conditions, and in one condition they're exercising in the morning, doing intermittent cycling exercise, and in the other condition they're exercising in the afternoon at about 4 p.m., then counterintuitively, their blood sugar regulation is actually temporarily worse during the early exercise, whereas during the afternoon exercise, it improves. And exercise, of course, can strongly affect things like non-insulin mediated glucose uptake by skeletal muscles being the largest glucose sink that you have in your body, at least for people who aren't very sarcopenic. And for that reason, even if somebody's sedentary, their circadian variation and insulin sensitivity is such that theoretically it's best to confine lots of carbohydrates early in the waking period at the start of the day. If they're exercising in the afternoon, then they're going to more or less nullify that daily variation. So then if they're eating lots of carbohydrates late in the day, that's much less likely to be problematic. And just while I'm on the subject of macronutrient distribution, when we think about diet timing, there are lots of different things to consider. So there's the caloric period, and shorter tends to lead to lower energy intake, but it's harder to do. But there's also how you distribute calories within that caloric period. So you could have a 10-hour caloric period from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m., but you could have 95% of your calories at 6 a.m. and 5% at 4 p.m. So that's heavily front loaded. Conversely, you could have 95% finishing at 4 p.m. And that seems to have a meaningful effect on certain outcomes. And I often speak about a study that Danielle Jakubovic did in 2013, showing that in women on standardized weight loss diets, a group that consumed half their calories at breakfast lost more than twice as much weight, more than twice as many inches off their waist, and had greater improvements in blood sugar and blood lipids compared to a group that had 50% of their calories at dinner. And they've subsequently published other work in populations such as people who have type 2 diabetes, showing that front-loading calorie intake and carbohydrate in particular dramatically improves blood sugar regulation, even when energy intake is standardized. And interestingly, they reported a couple of years ago that in this group of people going through 12 weeks of having about half their calories at breakfast and half their carbohydrate intake for the day at breakfast too, compared to a group that had about a fifth and spread out their daily intake over a slightly longer period, the differences were very stark. So only the early eating condition led to weight loss. They lost about 5 kilos, which is meaningful. This is a 12-week period. And they also spent about 83% more time within a healthy range of blood sugar. They were wearing continuous glucose monitors to track the levels of glucose in the interstitial fluid at the time, which is clinically huge. And they also were able to reduce their dose of insulin. And obviously, when you take medications such as insulin, along with that comes not only the cost of the insulin, but various side effects too. So simply optimizing the distribution of energy intake, independent of the total caloric period, can have substantial effects in these populations. But that brings up a related point, which is that time-restricted eating is probably more likely to benefit somebody if their metabolic health isn't that good at baseline. And I sometimes work with athletes with very large energy intakes. They need thousands and thousands and thousands of calories each day just to maintain their body weight. And I wouldn't put them on time-restricted eating protocols. I myself typically spread out my intake over about 12 hours each day. I find that if anything, I'm prone to losing weight. So for me, if I started using a 6-hour caloric period each day, then I don't think it would work that well for me. I have used it before during periods in which I've lost fat and found it helpful, but you should probably scale it according to your goals. And if you're interested in fat loss, then I think that there are good reasons to think that it can be helpful. And then finally, the other dimension of diet timing that I'll mention two actually. One is regularity. One of the advantages of time-restricted eating is that people tend to eat at more regular times each day. And independent of other factors, that seems to be a good thing. And Ian McDonald's published some nice work on this, showing that in healthy young women, when they consume a fixed number of meals each day compared to a varying number of meals, but the average number of meals is the same, the number of calories they consume is the same, and the macronutrients they consume are the same. During the regular condition, they have better blood sugar regulation and more healthy blood lipids too, at least according to how most people view blood lipids. So regularity is key. And then finally, within each dietary event, whether it's a snack or a meal, how people eat is important. And this isn't really related to the circadian system, but just want to add it for completeness. And that's to say that when people consume carbohydrate-rich items at the end of dietary events, they consume lots of fiber and protein and fat at the start, their blood sugar and insulin responses are dramatically better than when they consume the carbohydrates at the start. So if you think about having a salad, that's a really smart thing to do in terms of metabolic health. And interestingly, if you look at those studies, then they make sure that people eat every morsel of food. But looking at the hormonal responses to participants in these studies, what you'd probably find is that when they have the protein, the fat, and the fiber-rich foods first, they'd actually go on to eat less of the carbohydrate-rich foods because they have stronger satiety hormone responses to it. So in a free living condition, I suspect that if anything, the difference would be greater still. And that difference, to give people an idea of its magnitude, seems to be something like a 40 to 70% lower blood sugar response when people save the carbohydrates for the ends of foods, the ends of meals. So another long-winded answer, but I think those are some of the key factors for people to consider. It has to come down to practicality. Regularity is key. And if you eat relatively late in the day, then doing some exercise in the afternoon is likely to offset many of the suboptimal effects of that.
Okay, that's good to know. And yeah, the carbohydrates last part when you're having a meal is such a practical and easy solution to lowering our postprandial glucose excursions. So this could be in a very realistic setting. If you have a plate of broccoli, chicken, and sweet potatoes, eat the broccoli and chicken first and the sweet potatoes last. Yeah, so if we are pushing our window later in the day, you think that this is fine so long as it stays regular, like it's very regular. So say you're eating from noon to 8 p.m. every day and maybe doing some exercise closer to the end of the eating window.
Yeah, and if people can't exercise, or if they have to exercise early in the day, then I think that's fine too. I think the regularity is important. And what I'd say is that in that context, I just think about redistributing the energy intake. So even if you went to bed at 9 p.m. and you're eating up to 8 p.m., if your dietary event, say it's a meal at 8 p.m., is only 20% of your daily energy intake, and you've had 80% of your daily energy intake by 3 p.m., then that's quite different from having a very large dinner at 8 p.m. Mm-hmm. And independent of the circadian system, having a modest dinner or a modest final dietary event is likely to positively affect sleep. Interestingly, if you look at the time-restricted eating research, then one of the anecdotes that you see, because this is often assessed using a Likert type scale in which people just rate the quality of their sleep on a scale of 1 to 10 or something like that. But people typically self-report that the quality of their sleep is slightly higher when they're using time-restricted eating. And there has been some work showing that a smaller final meal each day tends to increase parasympathetic activity in the autonomic or automatic nervous system at night, which should be conducive to restorative sleep. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you don't want to go to bed hungry, but going through a period in which you adapt to a slightly smaller final meal is likely to, over time, positively affect not only your metabolic health, but possibly your sleep too.
Does food intake activate our sympathetic nervous system?
I think that's a good question. But if anything, it would probably not tend to too much necessarily. I think a lot of it depends on your perceptions of the food.
Okay.
So if you think about your parasympathetic nervous system, then it's important to digesting food. Mm-hmm. So if you could put yourself in a state in which you've got more parasympathetic activity, then you're going to better digest and process that food. Whereas if you've got more activity in the sympathetic branch of the system, then not only is your digestion going to be compromised, but your blood sugar responses to the meal are going to be compromised too. But does it per se change activity in the autonomic nervous system? To be honest, I'm not very familiar with that research. And I think the practical point for people should be that they want to do what they can to only eat when they're feeling relatively relaxed. They should eat mindfully, of course. And if you look at mindful eating interventions, then they seem to be good for all sorts of different outcomes. When people eat mindfully, they're less likely to engage in so-called disordered eating. Mm-hmm. And if they're eating mindfully and more slowly too, then they might actually find that they eat less as well. One of the things that you often find in those studies is that people lose a little bit of weight during those mindful interventions. Mm-hmm. So I think the practical point should be sit down at the dinner table, eat with people that you love, take your time and enjoy your food.
Yeah, I guess it wouldn't make sense if it activated sympathetic nervous activity, because rest and digest would be our parasympathetic and fight or flight would be. And part of the fight or flight, isn't it like shutting down our bowel, like our digestive system and stuff, so that we can run away from a tiger or something?
Yeah, or it's just eliminating anything that's in it, which is unfortunate.
Okay, let's move on from food and meal timing and talk about light exposure. So you mentioned bright light exposure for setting our circadian rhythms, and the earlier we can shift it to be earlier to optimize our sleep later in the day. So what is the best time to expose ourselves to sunlight specifically? And then I want to get into blue light blocking glasses and talk about their legitimacy and if you use them and if you recommend them.
Okay. So the best time is person dependent. And I think it's often the case that there might be a best time on paper, but the best time isn't practical for people. And so I generally give very generic recommendations and tell people that they should aim to spend at least 1 hour outside in daylight each day, and ideally spend as much of that time as possible in a natural setting. But with that said, if somebody wants to shift their sleep earlier, if you've got the night owl type, then as I touched on, they want to try and get more of that type of light exposure within a couple of hours of waking. So I'm not suggesting that they necessarily wake to an alarm clock, although that can definitely help them shift their sleep early, because that will also help them build sleep pressure, which will help them fall asleep early the following evening. But if they can get outside within a couple of hours of waking up into daylight and ideally do some exercise at that time, then that would be great. One of the things I haven't mentioned is that exercise itself, physical activity itself, does seem to be a weak time cue for both the peripheral clocks and the master clock too, most likely. And interestingly, exercise and light exposure might have additive effects on shifting certain circadian rhythms. So being active outdoors within a couple of hours of waking is going to be good for night owls. And then at the other side of the day, in the couple of hours before they plan to go to bed, systematically reducing their light exposure will help them avoid then shifting their previously earlier body clock later back to the schedule that it used to be on. On the other hand, if you've got the elderly person who is consistently waking up at 3 or 4 a.m. and nodding off on the sofa at 6 p.m., that person is likely to benefit from reducing exposure to light early in the day. And if they're indoors, that could entail wearing blue blockers, or it could entail wearing sunglasses, provided that they can stay safe and they don't end up tripping over things in the house. And then later in the day, in the probably 2 to 3 hour period before they plan to go to bed. When I say 2 to 3 hour period, what I mean is from 3 hours before to 2 hours before, they should look to get some of that high intensity light exposure, which will shift their clock later. If it's too close to bedtime, then they'll then just find it harder to fall asleep. So there's a sweet spot there, which is probably relatively narrow. In recent times, a lot of people have started speaking extensively about the importance of viewing dawn and dusk in particular. I know this is something that you asked about via email before we spoke. And I don't think there's much magic to it. It's clear that the cells in our eyes do track dawn and dusk. And in some organisms, it seems that spectral changes in the light will influence the circadian system too, independent of things like the illumination. And that's true in humans too. But I think it's not practical to tell people to get outside at dawn and dusk and view dawn and dusk respectively. And that's also predicated on the idea that people have light dark cycles that are modest. So if you lived at the equator, then you've got a 12-hour light dark cycle each day. So you've got 12 hours of light and then 12 hours of dark. If, however, you live in a polar region, in the summer, you can have 24 hours of daylight, and in the winter, you can have 24 hours of darkness. So telling that person to get outside and view dawn and dusk respectively is idiotic. So I think the most important thing is for people to think about whether they want to shift their body's clocks. And if they're real night owls or real morning larks, then to optimize the timing of that exposure. But for most people, just spending a bit more time outside each day will shift them a bit earlier. And for most people, that would be a good thing, because a lot of people still wake to alarms. Before the pandemic, it was something like 80% of people in Northern Europe. Right now, I suspect that number's lower because people have more control over their schedules and they don't have the commutes for work in the morning, etc. So I think practically that's a good way to go. And then with respect to blue blockers, if you look at the research that's been done so far, there's not much of it. There's a systematic review published not long ago, and it reported that they don't necessarily seem to be good for eye health. So if you look at health of the macula or the retina, then there's not strong evidence showing that just yet. And people are interested in things like digital eye strain. It just hasn't been that well studied just yet. In the case of sleep, there's a bit of work showing that people who have insomnia feel like they sleep better when they use blue blocking glasses on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the best sleep possible. It's probably just under 1 point. In healthy people, they don't seem to experience anything. And so based on that, you might think, well, Greg thinks that blue blockers are useless. And I absolutely don't. I think they certainly have their place. The times when I would recommend them for most people would be during jet lag. And if you want personalized light dark cycle recommendations during jet lag, check out the free website jetlagRooster.com. You can enter the details of your travel and it will give you a schedule, which might not be perfect, but it'll be pretty helpful. And it should help you adjust faster to the new time zone by changing when you're exposed to high intensity light and when you're trying to stay in the dark as much as possible. The other context in which I think they're particularly helpful with shift work, there is some work showing that when people are returning home from shift work, when they use blue blocking glasses, they tend to sleep better. And the tricky thing with shift work is, of course, is that they're often trying to sleep when it's light outside, the temperature is rising, it's noisy, etc. And all those different things can conspire to disrupt their sleep. And I think that blue blockers, provided that they don't make people drowsy on the drive home, are a simple way to help those people at least fall asleep slightly faster. And then in terms of blue blocking glasses and what to look for, I think it's difficult to tell which models are the best. And what I would just say is that there are some that have prescription lenses too. The reason I say that I think it's difficult to tell is just that I'm not aware of many companies that have shown the results of third-party testing describing the specifications of their products and which wavelengths they block and so on. Mm-hmm. But I think that most of them are likely to do the job relatively effectively. A lot of it comes down to personal preferences. I have some pairs, which a friend very kindly gave me, James Strong from Red Light Rising, another shameless plug. And I like them and I use them in particular during jet lag. But I think for most people, they're certainly not essential. They're nice to have, not a need to have.
So if someone is going to watch TV until they fall asleep, would it be beneficial to wear them? Like if they're not going to change their behavior and turn off the TV and avoid light, would you recommend wearing blue light blocking glasses?
I don't think that it's something that most people should be concerned about. And the reason is that most people should instead focus on spending more time outside each day if they're not spending enough time outside in daylight. That will buffer them against any negative effects of small amounts of light at night. The stronger the time cue that you give yourself during the day, the less likely your body clock is to shift in response to watching TV or something like that. And provided that the lighting environment in general is quite dim, I think it's okay. And the other thing about TV is that a lot of people use that as part of their wind down routine in the evening. And whether it's good or bad really depends on the content of the TV that you're watching. So if you're watching something which is really engaging, maybe very emotive, or if you're watching the news and there's a lot of uncertainty in whatever you're watching, then that can of course interfere with your subsequent sleep. But if you're watching a rerun of a comedy, which is something where you can recite the words from, it's very familiar, you'll find that relaxing. And provided that Netflix isn't auto playing episode after episode, you'll probably be okay. But that is important to mention, because if you think about TVs, but also things like smartphones, they influence us because you've got the light exposure. Again, more daytime light exposure, the less of an issue that's likely to be. And if you look at the studies of things like tablet use at night, then one of the limitations of them is that they normally have people in very dim lighting before that. So of course you're going to see an effect of using the tablet. If people have been outside, you wouldn't have seen the effect. So there's the light exposure, there's the content, but then there's that loss of mindfulness about time passing too. So as long as you can be mindful of time and set reasonable limits on yourself and your TV consumption, you'll probably be okay. But just for completeness, I do think that smartphones are a slightly different story. And during the pandemic, people are using their smartphones more than they were before it. Again, that's not inherently bad. I think of this as being a lot like nutrition. It depends on the content. You can binge eat unhealthy foods. You can spend loads of time on your phone, doom scrolling through your newsfeed or some meaningless social media stuff. Or you can eat healthy foods in sufficient quantities. You can use your smartphone to stay in touch with people you love. You can pick up your phone and call someone you haven't spoken with for the last couple of weeks. So I don't think they're inherently bad, but the way that most people use them isn't conducive to healthy circadian system function or sleep. And there's been some research in recent years, and in particular, a very interesting study published very recently showing that if you take people who regularly use their smartphones around bedtime and you have them turn off their smartphones for a period of several weeks, 30 minutes before they plan to go to bed, they fall asleep faster, they sleep slightly longer, their sleep efficiency is slightly higher, so the proportion of time that they're in bed that they're actually asleep is slightly higher. And their function the next day is better too. So people have measured their working memory and shown improvements as a result of turning off their smartphones earlier. So turn off your smartphone, don't take it to your bedroom, leave it on the kitchen table or wherever, and you're likely to benefit from that. So sorry, another tangent.
No, that's awesome. A couple more questions about sleep. So I take melatonin most nights, but I don't know if there's any negative consequences to this. I sleep great. I have really good sleep. Also wanted to ask you about tracking because I wear an Oura ring as well. And people have differing opinions on tracking different metrics. So first question is melatonin. What is your opinion on taking it and maybe dosing? And can we build a dependence on it? Because that is something I'm scared of. So when I travel, when I go home to see my parents or something, I actually don't pack melatonin just to give myself that break and make sure I can prove to myself that I can fall asleep without it. But I think it's also a placebo where I'm like, okay, I had melatonin, so that means it's time for bed, and I don't look at my phone or something like that because I'm like, oh, I already had melatonin. So yeah, just touch on melatonin for a sec.
Okay. So one thing to mention is that when you take melatonin as a supplement, the subsequent levels of melatonin in your body and your brain are substantially higher than they would be physiologically had you not taken that supplement. And so it's a little bit different from the melatonin in your body, which mostly acts as a signal of darkness when you take it exogenously. And it does have weak sleep promoting effects. So if you look at the meta-analyses of melatonin use and sleep, then they show that people fall asleep a few minutes faster, they sleep a few minutes longer, and their sleep is slightly more efficient, all of which are good things. Interestingly, people don't seem to develop tolerance to melatonin based on the studies that have been published so far. And it doesn't seem to be particularly habit forming, although you might be bucking the trend there by the sounds of things. And there's no strong evidence showing that when people keep taking melatonin, there's downregulation of melatonin receptors. There are two types of melatonin receptors in humans. And so based on all of that, you might think, well, I can just take melatonin indefinitely. But I think there are some caveats. And one is that studies have only really gone out as far as a year or so. So we don't know much about the effects of melatonin beyond that. There are theoretical reasons to think that long-term melatonin use could have some negative effects. I mentioned receptor downregulation. That's plausible. You see that with most different neuromodulators and hormones. If somebody takes testosterone exogenously, then after a while, you'll probably see changes in receptor numbers, sensitivities, but also downregulation of your body's own synthesis of it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's no evidence of that being the case with melatonin supplementation, but it makes sense because most of these systems work through negative feedback mechanisms.
Right.
So there's that, but then melatonin isn't just something that tells your body cells that it's dark outside, and therefore, in the case of the brain, to start to coordinate its circuits so that you can fall asleep. It does have other effects. And one of the effects is to change biology according to season, according to the prevailing light-dark cycle. This does seem to be something that happens in humans in naturalistic settings. Ken Wright did some fantastic work on this, and they published research in 2013 and 2017 showing that during the winter, when people go camping, their body's melatonin period is about 4 hours longer than when they go camping during the summer. So it's clear that that longer dark phase leads to a longer period of melatonin synthesis. But in our built environments in which artificial light is so pervasive, you probably don't see that seasonal variation nearly as much. What are the consequences of that in humans? We really don't know. But in other animals that are more seasonal, and in particular animals that have seasonal change in reproduction, melatonin is very important in determining some of those seasonal changes in the reproductive function. So in particular, there's part of the brain named the pars tuberalis that's very important to coordinating some of those changes. And that's just in the pituitary gland. And you can therefore give animals melatonin and influence their breeding behavior quite substantially. Is that likely to be the case in humans? I don't think so. Not based on anything that I've seen. And just to complete that thought, if what happens in other animals happened in humans, taking melatonin would temporarily impair reproductive function. Again, there's no evidence of that in humans to my knowledge. And there are plenty of instances where I think that melatonin can be used therapeutically. We focus then on sleep, and lots of people with sleep difficulties use melatonin, of course, and it's most helpful in delayed sleep phase disorder when people naturally find themselves going to bed very late and waking up very late. Melatonin taken several hours before sleep can help drag their sleep earlier and therefore help improve their quality of life because they can live in better alignment with the rest of the planet. It's very helpful in people with non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder. Those people often have dysfunctional retinal photoreceptors. They're typically blind. And because of that, the light that hits the eye doesn't really go back to the master clock effectively. So their body's clocks run free and they drift. And then there are periods of time where they're living in time, but then at other times they're living out of time with the rest of society. Again, in that context, melatonin can be life-changing. And then in insomnia, it can have small beneficial effects and doesn't have many of the downsides of other sleep drugs. And there are many categories of these drugs, but they often come with nasty side effects, as well as leading to habit formation, tolerance, and withdrawal symptoms when people stop taking them. And then regarding those other therapeutic applications, I mentioned that part of my PhD that looked at melatonin as a prophylactic agent against the development of type 2 diabetes. And there are reasons to think that people with poor cardiometabolic health might benefit from melatonin supplementation. If you look at how much 6-sulfur-toxy melatonin they excrete, which is the primary metabolite of melatonin, it tends to be lower than healthy people. If you look at their circadian rhythms, you typically see abnormalities at various different levels of the circadian hierarchy. And when some of these people supplement with melatonin over a period of several weeks or months, it seems that some of them experience relatively large reductions in oxidative stress, or measures of oxidative stress at least, some improvements in blood sugar regulation, and possibly some improvements in blood lipids and blood pressure too. So there's that application as well. And then in terms of how to use it, I think it's most helpful for most people in the context of jet lag. The optimal dose is probably around 1 milligram. I think for effects on sleep alone, lower doses are better, if anything. And about 300 micrograms seems to be helpful. And I think the lower dose is probably less likely to lead to any long-term negative consequences. But for somebody who's looking to improve their cardiometabolic health, they probably need higher quantities of melatonin, maybe 5 milligrams or so. And then melatonin does come in different forms. You've got regular melatonin, which is quite fast acting. Its half-life is something like 45 minutes. But there are newer forms of melatonin with substantially longer half-lives. And there's a form named Circadian, which is made, I think, by Neuron Pharmaceuticals. And that has a substantially longer half-life. So that's more likely to be helpful if you're struggling to stay asleep through the night. Melatonin will be better at helping you fall asleep initially. Time-release melatonin would help you avoid waking frequently through the night. And that's been studied in some elderly populations and also in people who have sleep maintenance insomnia. Again, it seems to be somewhat beneficial for those people. So long story short, I think there are several applications in which melatonin makes sense. There are ways to use it that are better than others. And we don't know that much about the long-term safety of melatonin use, but all of the studies done so far indicate that it seems to be very well tolerated, taken for at least as long as a year. In terms of using it, I wouldn't recommend using it for more than 12 weeks or so without cycling off it for at least a period of time.
Okay, I'm reconsidering my protocol then. But
what is your protocol?
I take it most nights, basically every night. I don't know, it's just part of my routine and it has been for a really long time. So I'm now reconsidering and kind of wary about it.
I think the other thing that you have to consider is that people vary in their responses to things. And so if on average people fall asleep 5 minutes faster, they sleep 12 minutes longer when they take melatonin, then there are going to be some people who fall asleep 15 minutes faster and sleep for 45 minutes longer, and their sleep is 6% more efficient when they take melatonin. And I know many people who have supplemented with it and they feel like it dramatically affects their sleep. My girlfriend uses it sometimes.
Like improves?
Yeah.
Okay.
My girlfriend uses it sometimes and she feels like it's a magic pill.
It is, I swear.
Yeah. And she sleeps so much better when she takes it. And if you think about that and the fact that it quite plausibly is dramatically improving sleep for those people, then you have to weigh up the downsides of any small long-term effects of taking it with the upsides of consistently getting longer, more efficient sleep. And when you weigh those two, you might well think that taking it in the long term is worth it. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to assess it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and this brings me to my next question on sleeping pills, like actual pharmaceutical knock you out pills. For example, my brother cannot sleep to save his life. He just can't stay asleep. He can't fall asleep. He does everything. He has tried meal timing, light exposure, meditation, essential oils, like everything, anything like natural. But at what point does the benefit outweigh the risk? Because he needs to sleep. What about sleeping pills in someone who literally just doesn't get enough sleep?
I think that they shouldn't be the first port of call. So it sounds like your brother might have insomnia, and I always try and default to using behavioral therapies or cognitive behavioral therapies with people first. And the reason is that in the short term, they seem to be at least as effective as using sleep medications, but they're more or less free. In the long term, they tend to be much better for sleep and for overall health. There's minimal risk of side effects too. So I think if those have been exhausted, then there's definitely a time and a place for sleep medications. And some, of course, are better than others. And it's not as if there's one best one. Many of them are helpful in different scenarios. And that's in part related to how they act. It's also related to their overall profile. So, for example, there are some that have some antidepressant effects. And if somebody has very low mood, then it's likely that it's going to benefit their daytime function and their nighttime sleep too. And just to touch on some of those drugs, you have your benzodiazepines and non-benzodiazepine receptor agonists. And both of those primarily target GABA A pathways in the brain. And they've been around for a long time. They tend to slightly increase the amount of time people spend in stage 2 sleep, which is a relatively light stage of sleep, but reduce the amount of time people spend in deep sleep. And like most sleep drugs, they do lead to some side effects and withdrawal effects and tolerance over time. Then you have some other drugs, including some antidepressants and antipsychotics that can have some sleep promoting effects. And in people with mental health problems, they can be really helpful. You then have some Erection receptor antagonists, and these are newer drugs, and they seem to be quite promising in many instances. The one that's often used is called suvorexant. And then you have not only melatonin, but also melatonin receptor analogs too. Ramelteon, tasimelteon, there are a few of them. And unlike many of those other classes of drugs, they don't seem to have such bad side effects. But they're also sometimes not as potent at helping sleep as some of those other ones, or at least when I say helping sleep, what I mean is making people fall asleep faster, etc. So they have their place. Which one is appropriate for a given individual depends on their overall phenotype. So whether mood is a problem, etc. And people should only resort to them if they've exhausted other options first. Mm-hmm. And there are many instances in which it does make sense to go to them first. But personally, when I'm helping people, I try and stay away from them.
Right. Okay. And another note on melatonin. So in my initial email, I did ask about how we should space our meals away from melatonin supplementation. So because of the receptors on the pancreas, insulin sensitivity, et cetera. Do you think that if we were to eat late at night, meal high in carbohydrates, then taking a melatonin supplement right before bed would impair our metabolism?
So melatonin seems to act on those receptors in the pancreas and inhibit glucose-stimulated insulin secretion. So you have more sluggish insulin responses, and as a result of that, you'll have more exaggerated blood sugar responses to meals if they're consumed in the presence of high amounts of melatonin. And as I mentioned earlier, the amount of melatonin in your body when you've taken melatonin as a supplement is quite different from when you've got the stuff synthesized from your pineal gland and you just have your natural levels. And interestingly, people have looked at whether acute melatonin intake affects blood sugar responses to meals and insulin responses to meals too. And the research that's coming to mind was done by Marta Garrelay, and she did some work in 2015 looking at what happens when you give people 5 milligrams of melatonin, and then 15 minutes later, you give them a 75-gram bolus of glucose, so an oral glucose tolerance test. And she had people do this at 2 different time points. So in one condition, they took the melatonin at 9 a.m. and then had the glucose at 9:15. And in the other condition, it was 9 p.m. and then the glucose at 9:15 p.m. And what she found was that during the daytime, the melatonin consumption dramatically worsened blood sugar responses to the glucose tolerance test. However, at night, that effect was basically nullified, and it didn't affect blood sugar responses nearly as much. There is another variable at play, which is somebody's melatonin receptor 1B genotype. And this is getting to the weeds a bit, and I not suggesting that people go away and get themselves genotyped for anything at all, because I think that that has very limited utility. But if you look at all of the different common variants that influence risk of diseases such as type 2 diabetes, then there's a polymorphism in the melatonin receptor 1b gene that's very common. I think about 53% of Northern Europeans have it. It does seem to influence risk a bit, and it increases risk of diabetes, increases fasting glucose a little bit, and so on. And
wait, what does it do though? How does it affect the melatonin receptor?
It's I think it's a gain of function phenotype. So basically, that effect of melatonin on insulin that I mentioned earlier is exaggerated in these people because of changes in the melatonin receptor 1b. And people who have that common polymorphism seem to respond more negatively to the melatonin supplementation in terms of their blood sugar responses. And the difference between people with the risk polymorphism and people without it is actually quite substantial. So I think
perhaps they sleep better though.
Yeah, maybe. Although I believe that there don't seem to be large differences in how they sleep. I haven't looked at that literature for several years though. So practically, I think if people are taking melatonin at night, it's unlikely to be an issue. It'd be more of an issue if they were taking it during the daytime. They shouldn't be too concerned about it. Okay. And with that said, I think it's prudent to just have your final calories a day relatively early anyway, and then it becomes a non-issue, because the best time to take melatonin, if like you just want to improve your sleep, you're not trying to move your sleep timing or anything like that, best time to take it is probably 30 to 60 minutes before your planned bedtime.
Yeah, and you shouldn't be eating at that time anyways. So
yeah, so if you're finishing your dinner 3 hours before bedtime, and I generally suggest at least 3 hours, then it's really a non-issue for you.
Okay. So yeah, let's wrap it up and just touch on quickly your general tips for optimizing our circadian rhythms, whether that's with meal timing, light exposure, exercise even. So you said like exercising later in the day is when we might experience the most strength. So what are your general tips for optimizing our circadian rhythms?
General tips would be spend at least an hour outside each day during daylight. And if you want to go to bed earlier and wake up earlier, then try and make that within 2 hours of waking up. If you want to go to bed later and wake up later, then try and make that in that 2 to 3 hour window before you plan to go to bed. And then at the other side of the day, reduce your exposure to light. So if you're a night owl, that means reducing your exposure to light by dimming some lights, turning off some lights in the 2 hours or so before your planned bedtime. And if you're a real early bird, then it means using those same methods and possibly using sunglasses or blue blockers in the first couple of hours of waking up in the morning. So light is key. Regarding meal timing, I think people should probably wait at least half an hour after their natural wake time before consuming any calorie-containing items. And they should eat at regular times from one day to the next. I think minimizing snacking makes sense because most people snack mindlessly. So having designated meals is typically a good way to go. And usually suggest using a caloric period or a time restricted eating window of anywhere between 6 and 12 hours. And I think people should probably typically start at the upper end of that range and see how it works in the context of their lifestyles, because jumping into a caloric period which is too short can just put them off, and then they revert to their old ways and don't experience some of those beneficial effects of time restricted eating that we discussed. I think within that caloric period, meals should probably be spaced 3 to 6 hours apart. And at each meal, it makes sense to have carbohydrate dense items at the end of the meal or the snack respectively. And also I think that each of the meals should contain a sufficient bolus of protein. I know that you've spoken with Stu Phillips previously, and he's done fantastic work on that over several decades. And I think that the appropriate dose of protein is probably about 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per meal. So if you're 100 kilos, that'd be 40 grams of a high quality protein. And if you're relatively inactive, it makes sense to fix that eating window as early in your waking day as possible. If that's not practical in the context of your life, then if you're eating windows later, then think about whether you can front load your calorie and carbohydrate intake within that eating window. If you're exercising, that's less of a concern. And on the subject of exercise, I think that the best time at which to exercise is very variable between people. And I'd much rather just have people exercise than not exercise because they feel like they're not exercising the optimal time. But the best time at which to do strength and power exercise, think jumping, sprinting, lifting weights, is probably in the late biological afternoon, which for somebody with a very average chronotype would probably be around 5 or 6 p.m. And I think that people should finish very strenuous exercise 3 or 4 hours at the latest before they plan to go to bed, because done too late in the day, it will tend to disrupt their sleep. Mm-hmm. That hasn't actually been shown by all the research done so far, but I think that's in part because of the way that the studies are conducted. And I think in the real world it would. I won't go into the details of why that's the case, but I think that's fair guidance. With respect to endurance exercise, the best time of day isn't so clear. It seems to be very variable between people. There's a guy, Ralph Nair, who's done some really interesting work on this in recent years. And so I think you should probably experiment to find out what works best for you. If you're exercising for metabolic health and you're doing intermittent exercise, then it seems that doing it in the afternoon is probably best. If you're, say, a person who has diabetes and is looking to improve your blood sugar regulation. And then there are some other things to consider too. So one, going back to diet, of course, is caffeine intake. And I think that not consuming caffeine in the several hours before going to bed makes a lot of sense. Again, people vary hugely in how they metabolize caffeine. For some people, the half-life is less than 4 hours. For some people, it's more than 24. And so if you're sensitive to caffeine and you metabolize it slowly, then you should probably avoid it when you can, if not have very small amounts very early in the day. Whereas if you're somebody who can seemingly have an espresso at dinner time and sleep fine, it's quite a different story for you. But rule of thumb, I think you're going to experience most of the benefits of caffeine by capping your intake at about 3 milligrams per kilo. And on average, I think stopping that at least 9 hours before bedtime is doable and is also likely to help you avoid those negative effects of caffeine on sleep. With respect to alcohol, alcohol tends to make people fall asleep faster, and they spend a greater proportion of the early sleep period in the deeper stage of sleep, and people think that sounds great. The problem is that alcohol is a muscle relaxant. So if you're somebody who snores, then your upper airway is more likely to collapse after drinking. So that's going to exacerbate your snoring, or if you have sleep apnea, it will exacerbate that. And interestingly, people who drink more are more likely to go on to develop sleep apnea in years to come too. And alcohol also increases urination. So you're more likely to wake up to need to pee during the evening. And then as it's metabolized into acetaldehyde and acetate, and those lead to all sorts of nasty effects too. So it's no great surprise that the day following a bit of a session, people tend to be quite impaired. So I think moderating your alcohol intake, I don't want to be a massive killjoy and say never drink, but I think moderating it makes a lot of sense. Difficult to provide guidelines because people differ so much in how they metabolize alcohol. But the earlier the better. The best time for booze is in fact breakfast, contrary to popular opinion. And I think that those are some of the core things, but a couple more things to emphasize are the importance of regularity. And I think that's most relevant to your bedtimes. So you should aim to go to bed at roughly the same times each day. People often focus on sleep duration, but there are many dimensions of sleep health. Timing is important. You should only go to bed when you're sleepy, but you should look to keep your bedtimes relatively fixed unless you're going through a phase in which you're trying to shift your chronotype earlier or later. So I think regular bedtimes gate the timing of the rest of your time cues. If you're asleep, you're not going to be outside in daylight, probably. So I think I'd start there, but then also having regular meal time seems to be key, in particular to those peripheral clocks. Getting plenty of sun exposure for most people in the middle of the day is helpful. And then also exercising at regular times is probably optimal. Sometimes it's not doable. I'd rather have people just do the exercise than worry about that. But if you can exercise at regular times, that can be handy, in particular if you're exercising with a view to shifting your clock. So if you're trying to shift your sleep earlier, exercising soon after waking will probably help you. If you're trying to shift it later, then exercising in that 3 to 4 hour period before bed is likely helpful. And on that note, the way that your body's clock responds to exercise is quite similar to the way that it responds to light, in terms of how the timing of exercise influences the direction of shifts in your clock. So I think those are some of the key circadian system health tips.
Cool. That's awesome. And all very practical. So thank you for laying that out. And where can people find you? What's new on the horizon? And we'll sign off.
People can find me at Greg Potter PhD on Instagram. And I have a website, which is Greg Potter PhD, which is terrible, so don't go there. And then I'd also point people to resilientnutrition.com, which is the company that I mentioned earlier. And we are on Instagram at resilientnuts. And if people are interested for more diet guidance in particular, then check out the free ebook, Principles of Resilient Nutrition, which is resilientnutrition.com/principles.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. There was a lot in there, a lot to unpack. So I really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Christy.